Your beta is armed. Don't!
Enter the carriage.
Dust motes danced in the heavy, oppressive air of the king's solar as Maeve's trembling fingers reached for the velvet collar of his royal doublet. Alistair Sterling, the ruthless alpha king of the northern reaches, stood completely still, his amber eyes fixed on the courtyard below. He expected a routine journey to secure a border treaty. He didn't expect the quiet, terrified whisper of a lowly chambermaid smoothing the fabric over his pulse point. "My king," Maeve breathed, her voice barely louder than the rustle of silk, her eyes cast downward. "Rowan is carrying silver." He tampered with the left axle. "Don't enter the carriage." High stone walls of Castle Ethelgard held the damp chill of late autumn, but inside the royal wing, the air was suffocatingly thick. The day of the sovereign summit had arrived. For a decade, the northern werewolf packs had been locked in a bloody, clandestine shadow war with the human merchants of the lowlands. Today was supposed to be the end of it. Lord Percival Montgomery, the wealthy human oligarch, had agreed to meet King Alistair at the neutral grounds of Oakhaven Keep to sign a blood pact of non-aggression. Maeve kept her head bowed as she carried the basin of warm, rose-scented water into the king's antechamber. She was a ghost in the castle, a mere human servant whose survival depended entirely on being entirely forgettable. A survivor of a rogue wolf attack that had decimated her village years ago, Maeve possessed an acute paranoia that made her dangerously observant. She knew the rhythms of Ethelgard better than the guards. She knew the heavy pine and musk scent of the Alpha King, and, more importantly, she knew the metallic, ozone-sharp stench of lethal intent. That morning, the castle had been a hive of chaotic preparation, but Maeve's attention had been drawn to Rowan Hastings. Rowan was the beta of the Sterling pack. He was Alistair's right hand, his childhood confidant, the man who had fought back-to-back with the king in the brutal trenches of the Red Valley skirmishes. Rowan was beloved by the court, a boisterous, laughing warrior with a penchant for strong ale and extravagant tales. But today, the beta was a stranger. Maeve had been polishing the brass sconces in the lower armory when she saw him. Rowan had slipped into the shadows near the carriage house, his posture rigid, his usual swagger completely absent. Maeve had frozen, pressing herself against the cold stone, holding her breath. She watched as Rowan met with a cloaked figure. Coins exchanged hands, heavy, gold imperials, not the standard pack currency. But it was what happened next that chilled the marrow in her bones. Rowan had unrolled a piece of oiled leather. Inside lay a dagger. Not a standard steel blade forged in the castle fires, but a jagged, pale weapon that seemed to absorb the dim light. Silver. Raw, unalloyed silver, coated in a viscous, dark paste that Maeve recognized instantly from her nightmares. Concentrated wolfsbane. A single scratch from that blade would paralyze an alpha. A deep cut would rot his heart within minutes. Before slipping the weapon into a hidden sheath in his boot, Rowan had walked over to the royal carriage, a massive reinforced vehicle of oak and iron. With a heavy wrench, he had deliberately loosened the iron lug holding the rear left axle, masking the sabotage with a layer of thick grease. If the carriage took a sharp turn on the steep cliffside roads leading to Oakhaven, the wheel would violently tear off, sending the king plummeting into the gorge below. Now, hours later, Maeve stood in the king's solar, her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She was just a maid. To speak out of turn to the Alpha King, to accuse his bonded beta of high treason, was a death sentence. Alistair was not known for his mercy. He was a leader forged in blood, a man whose amber eyes could strip the courage from a seasoned general. Alistair Sterling stood before the towering arched window, gazing out at his domain. He was a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders straining the dark, tailored fabric of his ceremonial doublet. The tension in his jaw was evident, the muscles leaping beneath his scarred skin. He hated politics. He hated the stuffy clothes. He was a creature of the forest, an apex predator forced to play the diplomat. "You are shaking, girl," Alistair rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't need to. His senses were infinitely sharper than a human's. He could hear her elevated heart rate, smell the cold sweat of pure terror radiating from her skin. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Maeve stammered, stepping forward with his heavy velvet mantle, the morning chill. "It is practically boiling in here," Alistair countered flatly, finally turning to face her. His gaze was piercing, an unsettling shade of gold that seemed to look right through her frail human facade. Do your job, and let us be done with this pageantry. Maeve stepped closer, the velvet mantle heavy in her arms. She reached up to drape it over his shoulders, her fingers brushing the stiff collar of his doublet. The proximity to the Alpha was overwhelming. The raw power rolling off him in invisible waves made her dizzy. She fastened the heavy silver clasp at his throat. Through the open window, the sharp voice of Rowan Hastings echoed from the courtyard below, barking orders at the stable hands. Ready the king's carriage. We ride in 10 minutes. Secure that left side. The hypocrisy of the shout snapped something inside Maeve. She thought of her village burning. She thought of the unchecked chaos that would consume the northern reaches if Alistair were murdered. The succession crisis would plunge the entire kingdom into a bloodbath, and the humans below would suffer the most. Her trembling fingers lingered on the collar, resting directly over the erratic, powerful pulse beating at the side of the king's neck. She leaned in, her lips barely an inch from his ear. She didn't have time for etiquette. She didn't have time for protocol. My king, Maeve breathed, her voice dropping to an urgent, terrified whisper. Rowan is carrying silver. He tampered with the left axle. Don't enter the carriage. For 3 agonizing seconds, the world stopped turning. Alistair Stirling did not move. He did not blink. The only indication that he had heard her at all was the sudden, terrifying drop in the temperature of the room. The oppressive heat of the solar vanished, replaced by an icy, suffocating pressure, the physical manifestation of an Alpha's killing intent. The golden hue of his eyes fractured, bleeding into a violent, luminescent yellow. A low, guttural vibration started deep within his chest. A sound so primal, it rattled the glass in the window panes. Maeve violently snatched her hands away and dropped to her knees, pressing her forehead against the cold stone floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the heavy blow, waiting for his claws to tear her throat out, for daring to speak such poisonous lies about his brother-in-arms. Instead, a heavy silence fell. Look at me, Alistair commanded. The voice was no longer human. It was the ragged snarl of the beast beneath the skin. Maeve slowly lifted her head. Alistair had crossed the distance between them in a blur, looming over her. He grabbed her chin with a large, calloused hand, forcing her to meet his unnatural gaze. He was searching her scent, scouring her physiological responses for any trace of deception. Fear, yes. Desperation, yes. But no deceit. A human could control their words, but they could not control the chemical scent of a lie. Rowan. Alistair repeated the name as if it were a foul taste on his tongue. You accuse the beta of my pack of plotting my assassination. You claim he carries silver, a death sentence. In his right boot, Your Grace, Maeve whispered, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over her lashes. A silver dirk, coated in wolfsbane. I saw him pay the stable master. I saw him grease the loosened lug on the rear left wheel. Please, I have nothing to gain by lying. If you enter that carriage, you will die. Alistair's grip on her chin tightened for a fraction of a second before he abruptly released her. He stood up to his full height, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying, mechanical precision. The yellow in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a cold, dead amber. The emotional withdrawal was sudden and absolute. He was a king going to war. If you are lying, little bird, Alistair said softly, walking past her toward the heavy oak doors, I will have you flayed in the courtyard. Stay here. Do not make a sound. Maeve collapsed against a heavy wooden chest as the door slammed shut behind him. She dragged herself to the window, peering over the stone sill down into the sprawling courtyard. Down below, the royal procession was ready. 24 elite wolf guard, clad in dark armor, sat atop massive, restless warhorses. In the center of the formation sat the royal carriage, the sunlight gleaming off its black lacquer and gold trim. Standing by the open carriage door was Rowan Hastings. He looked impeccable in his deep green leathers, a broad, confident smile on his handsome face as he joked with the captain of the guard. The heavy doors of the keep groaned open, and Alistair emerged. A hush fell over the courtyard. The king's stride was measured, unhurried, his heavy velvet mantle dragging slightly against the cobblestones. To anyone else, he looked like a sovereign preparing for a tedious diplomatic mission. But, from her vantage point, Maeve could see the subtle changes. Alistair's hands were slightly curled, his weight perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. He wasn't walking, he was stalking. Alistair! Rowan called out warmly, stepping forward and bowing his head in a show of deep respect. The guard is ready. The roads are clear. Oakhaven awaits. Thank you, Rowan, Alistair replied, his voice projecting across the silent courtyard. He stopped 5 paces from the carriage, his eyes locking onto the rear left wheel. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, his gaze slowly dragged to Rowan's right boot. Rowan's smile held, but Maeve saw the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth. The beta shifted his weight uneasily. "Is something wrong, my king?" Alistair slowly turned his head to look at his oldest friend. "I have decided against the carriage," Alistair announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "It is a beautiful morning. The air is crisp. I will ride at the head of the column. Bring me my horse." The command sent a shockwave through the courtyard. A king did not ride exposed to sniper fire or ambushes on a diplomatic mission through contested territory. "Alistair, be reasonable," Rowan countered, taking a step forward, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent hiss. "Protocol demands you ride secured. The Montgomery men are treacherous. If they see you on horseback, they might mistake it for an act of war, or worse, take a shot at you. Get in the carriage." It was a mistake. An Alpha's command was absolute. For a Beta to publicly contradict it, to order the king into the carriage, was an astonishing breach of hierarchy. The surrounding Wolf Guard tensed, hands drifting toward the pommels of their swords. "Are you commanding me, Rowan?" Alistair asked softly. The air in the courtyard seemed to freeze. Rowan realized his error immediately. He took a hasty step back, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "No, my king, of course not. I only advise." "I do not want your advice," Alistair snarled, taking a sudden, aggressive step forward. "I want to know why you are so desperate to put me in a rolling coffin. I want to know why you stink of fear. And most of all, brother." Alistair's voice dropped to a terrifying, deadly purr. "I want to see what you have in your right boot." Rowan froze. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His eyes darted frantically around the courtyard, calculating the odds, realizing the trap he had set had just snapped shut on his own neck. He looked at the heavy iron lug of the left wheel. He looked at the surrounding guards, and then he looked back at Alistair. The mask shattered. The jovial, loyal Beta vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "Take him down!" Rowan suddenly screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. Chaos erupted. The stable master, standing near the horses, suddenly drew a hidden crossbow and fired a heavy, silver-tipped bolt directly at the king's chest. Alistair, anticipating the betrayal, moved with supernatural speed. He twisted his torso, the heavy bolt tearing through the fabric of his mantle and shattering against the cobblestones. At the exact same moment, Rowan lunged. He dropped to one knee, his hand flashing toward his right boot. The movement was blindingly fast. When his hand came up, he gripped the hilt of a jagged, pale dagger. The sunlight caught the viscous, dark venom dripping from the silver edge. Alistair roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls like thunder. The king did not draw a sword. He didn't need to. As Rowan drove the poisoned dagger upward, aiming for Alistair's gut, the king caught Rowan's wrist in a vice-like grip. The sickening crunch of breaking bone echoed through the courtyard, followed instantly by Rowan's agonized scream. The silver dirk clattered uselessly to the ground. Up in the solar, Maeve clutched the window frame, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs as the courtyard devolved into a bloody battlefield. She had saved the king. But as she watched 3 of the royal wolf guard suddenly turn their blades on their own comrades to defend the traitorous Beta, she realized with mounting horror that the conspiracy was far deeper than one man. Rowan hadn't acted alone, and the nightmare was only just beginning. Steel sang a deadly, discordant song in the courtyard of Ethelgard. The 3 traitorous Wolfguardsmen Alistair had personally knighted surged forward, their broadswords drawn and aimed directly at their king. The rest of the royal guard froze for a critical, disastrous second, their minds unable to process the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. Wolves of the same pack did not turn on their alpha. It was a violation of their most sacred biological laws. But human gold, it seemed, could corrupt even the deepest instincts. Alistair did not freeze. The betrayal ignited a primordial fury in his blood, burning away the last vestiges of his diplomatic restraint. He released Rowan's shattered wrist, shoving the screaming Beta backward into the dirt, and pivoted to face the oncoming threat. The first guard, a massive brute named Bronson, swung his heavy Remington forged blade in a lethal arc aimed at Alistair's neck. The king ducked under the whistling steel with unnatural fluidity. As Bronson's momentum carried him forward, Alistair drove his palm upward, the heel of his hand, connecting with the underside of the traitor's jaw with the force of a battering ram. The sickening crack of the man's neck, snapping, echoed sharply, and Bronson collapsed in a lifeless heap. "Treason!" roared Captain Garrick, finally snapping out of his shock. "Defend the king! Slay the traitors!" The courtyard descended into absolute bedlam. Loyal guards clashed with the remaining conspirators. Horses reared and shrieked, their hooves striking stone and bone alike. The stablemaster who had fired the crossbow was quickly overrun by Garrick's men, run through with a dozen pikes before he could reload. Through the chaos, Alistair's glowing amber eyes tracked only one man, Rowan. The beta was scrambling backward through the mud and horseblood, cradling his mangled right arm against his chest. His face was a mask of sheer terror and physical agony. He was trying to reach the heavy iron portcullis leading to the lower bailey. "Rowan!" Alistair bellowed, a sound that carried the heavy, psychic weight of an alpha's command. The sheer force of the vocalization forced several nearby wolves to drop to their knees, their hands clutching their ears. Rowan staggered, his knees buckling under the instinctual urge to submit, but desperation drove him on. He kicked blindly at a loyalist guard, who tried to grab him, using the man's shield to vault himself behind a stone pillar. "You sold us to the humans," Alistair snarled, stalking through the melee. He didn't bother drawing a weapon. His fingernails had already elongated, calcifying into thick, razor-sharp claws that glinted in the autumn sun. "You sold the pack to the Vanderbilt Syndicate, didn't you? Only human oligarchs possess the kind of wealth to buy a beta's soul." "They promised me the North," Rowan screamed back from behind the pillar, his voice cracking with hysterical defiance. "Montgomery and Vanderbilt. They own the ports, Alistair. They own the coal. We are fighting a war we cannot win with claws and fangs. You are leading us into extinction. I was saving the pack." "You were saving yourself," Alistair growled, his muscles bunching as he prepared to leap the distance and tear his former brother apart. Before Alistair could strike, a deafening crack split the air. It wasn't the sound of a crossbow or a sword. It was the sharp, percussive report of a Winchester repeating rifle, a rare, devastating human weapon from the southern industrial zones. Alistair spun, his enhanced reflexes barely saving his life as a heavy lead slug tore through the heavy velvet of his mantle, grazing the meat of his shoulder. Blood, dark and rich, instantly soaked the fabric. High on the eastern battlements, a cloaked figure was jacking another round into the chamber of the rifle. The Vanderbilt Syndicate had not just sent gold, they had sent their elite human marksmen. "Sniper on the wall," Garrick yelled, raising his shield to cover the king. "Form up! Shield wall!" The royal guards immediately collapsed their perimeter, forming a tight ring of interlocked steel and oak around Alistair. In the brief, chaotic moment of the snipers covering fire, Rowan seized his chance. He bolted through the secondary archway, disappearing into the labyrinthine alleys of the lower keep, leaving a trail of blood from his shattered wrist. "Let him go," Alistair commanded sharply, grabbing Garrett by the shoulder as the captain prepared to pursue. The king's breathing was heavy, his eyes scanning the battlements. The sniper was already gone, melting back into the shadows of the castle. "My king, you are bleeding," Garrick said, his voice tight with concern as he eyed the dark stain spreading across Alistair's shoulder. "It is lead, not silver. It will heal," Alistair dismissed, his mind racing. The attack was too coordinated. The loosened wheel, the poisoned dirk, the hidden riflemen on the battlements. Ethelgard was heavily fortified against external sieges, but it was completely vulnerable from within. Rowan had been the head of castle security. If the beta was working for the human tycoons, then every guard, every servant, and every shadow in the keep was suspect. The summit was a distraction. The peace treaty was a lie. This was a decapitation strike, orchestrated by the wealthiest human families in the world. Suddenly, Alistair's head snapped up toward the highest tower of the royal wing. The Solar. The trembling little human maid. She had known about the silver. She had known about the carriage. She possessed intelligence that his own spy masters had missed. If Rowan realized she was the one who had foiled his trap, her life was worth less than the dirt beneath their boots. And Alistair Sterling, king of the northern reaches, did not leave his saviors to be slaughtered. "Lock down the courtyard," Alistair ordered Garrick, his voice deadly calm. "No one leaves. No one enters. Anyone who tries is to be executed on the spot. I have business upstairs." Without waiting for a response, the king broke from the shield wall, sprinting back toward the heavy oak doors of the keep. He moved with terrifying speed, ignoring the sting in his shoulder, his boots hammering against the stone steps as he ascended the grand staircase. Up in the solar, Maeve was paralyzed. She remained crouched beneath the windowsill, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth to muffle her own terrified sobs. She had seen everything. She had seen the king shatter the beta's arm. She had seen the terrifying, unnatural speed of the wolves in combat. And she had heard the unmistakable, thunderous roar of the human rifle. She needed to run. She needed to slip down the servants' stairwell, cross the kitchens, and disappear into the dense pine forests surrounding Ethelgard. If she stayed, the traitorous guards would eventually sweep the castle to eliminate witnesses. If the king survived, he might still kill her for knowing too much about the pack's internal weakness. Trembling, Maeve forced herself to stand. She grabbed her woolen shawl, wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. She took exactly 2 steps toward the hidden servants' door before the main doors of the solar were violently kicked open. The heavy oak slammed against the stone wall, splintering off the hinges. Maeve shrieked, stumbling backward against the heavy mahogany desk. Alistair stood in the doorway. He was a terrifying sight. His ceremonial doublet was torn and soaked with blood on the left side. His chest heaved with exertion, and the beast was still violently present in his eyes, a swirling molten gold that practically illuminated the dim room. His hands were coated in the blood of his own guards. He locked eyes with her, stepping into the room and kicking the broken door shut behind him. "Please," Maeve whimpered, pressing herself flat against the desk, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edges. "I didn't tell anyone else. I swear it. Let me go. I'll disappear." Alistair didn't speak immediately. He stalked toward her, the sheer physical presence of him making the air in the room feel heavy and suffocating. He stopped inches from her, towering over her trembling frame. He reached out, his massive, blood-stained hand moving toward her face. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the claws to end her life. Instead, she felt the rough pad of his thumb gently wipe a stray tear from her cheek. The touch was shockingly gentle, completely at odds with the violence radiating from him. "You saved my life," Alistair rumbled, his voice thick and gravelly. "A human servant, while my own brother sought to rot my heart with silver. Why? 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 Why?" Maeve opened her eyes, startled by the genuine question. She looked up into his face. The murderous rage had receded, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-laced curiosity. "Because I know what happens when the wolves lose their leader," Maeve whispered, her voice shaking. "When the Astor Syndicate funded the rogue packs in the borderlands 6 years ago, my village was caught in the crossfire. No one protected us. If you fall, the North burns. The humans will suffer the most." Alistair's jaw tightened. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the room, suddenly hyper-alert. "You are remarkably observant for a chambermaid. What else did you see, little bird? If Rowan was bought by Vanderbilt and Astor, this castle is crawling with their agents. What else did he do?" Maeve's mind raced. She thought back over the chaotic preparations of the last 3 days, the strange merchant wagons, the unusual deliveries. And then, a memory struck her with the force of a physical blow. "The wine," Maeve gasped, her eyes widening in horror. "The tribute from the lowland merchants. 3 dozen iron-banded barrels. Rowan ordered them placed in the catacombs beneath the Great Hall, near the foundational pillars. He said they needed to be kept in the deepest cold." Alistair frowned. "Wine is kept in the cellar, not the structural catacombs." "My king," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "I used to work in the mining camps before my village burned. I know the smell of black powder. The barrels didn't smell like grapes. They smelled like sulfur and saltpeter. They aren't wine barrels. They're blasting charges." The blood drained from Alistair's face. The assassination in the courtyard wasn't the main event. It was the distraction. If Rowan couldn't kill him quietly, he was going to bring the entire fortress of Ethelgard down on top of the royal court. He's going to detonate the foundations, Alistair realized, his voice hollow. The rifle shot. It was the signal. As if on cue, a deep, rhythmic thrumming began to echo through the stone floor beneath their feet. It wasn't the sound of men marching. It was the sound of heavy, rapid fuse wire sparking in the depths of the castle. "We have exactly 3 minutes before this entire wing collapses," Alistair stated, all emotion stripped from his voice. He reached out, grabbing Maeve firmly by the forearm. "You are coming with me." "What? No," Maeve panicked, trying to pull away. "I'll slow you down. Let me take the servant stairs." The servant stairs run parallel to the main chimney flues. They will be the first to collapse in a blast, Alistair snapped, effortlessly pulling her against his uninjured side. The heat radiating from him was intense. You are under my protection now, Maeve. The Alpha owes a life debt, and I do not intend to die today to leave it unpaid. We take the King's Passage. He dragged her toward the massive stone fireplace. Reaching inside the soot-stained mantle, Alistair pressed a hidden lever. With a grinding groan of heavy stone, the back wall of the fireplace swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel, plunging straight down into the mountain. Go, Alistair commanded, practically throwing her into the dark passage. Maeve stumbled into the darkness, the damp, freezing air of the mountain hitting her face. Alistair stepped in, right behind her, pulling the heavy stone door shut. The click of the locking mechanism echoed loudly in the cramped space. They were plunged into absolute pitch blackness. Maeve let out a small cry, her hands blindly reaching out, only to find the solid, muscular wall of the king's chest. She gasped, trying to pull back, but there was no room. They were pressed intimately together in the dark. Hold on to my belt, Alistair whispered, his breath hot against the top of her head. I can see in the dark. Do not let go, no matter what you hear above us. Before Maeve could process the terrifying proximity, a colossal, deafening roar shook the very core of the earth. The floor beneath them violently pitched upward. The explosives in the catacombs had detonated. Ethelgard was falling. The sheer concussive force of the blast tore through the ancient stone like a physical blow. The secret passage violently bucked beneath their feet, groaning as centuries of mortar and rock shifted under the catastrophic pressure. Maeve screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the deafening roar of collapsing architecture above them. Before a single falling rock could strike her, Alistair moved. He spun, slamming her back against the damp tunnel wall and caging her completely with his massive body. He buried her face in the uninjured side of his chest, wrapping his heavy mantle around them both. Dust, jagged splinters of stone, and raining debris battered against his broad back, but the king did not yield a single inch. To Maeve, trapped in the suffocating darkness of his embrace, the world was reduced to the frantic thudding of her own heart and the deep, steady drumbeat of the Alpha's pulse. Minutes stretched into eternity as Ethelgard crumbled above. Finally, the violent shaking subsided into a series of deep, structural shudders. The air was thick with pulverized stone, choking and dry. Alistair slowly pulled back, coughing heavily. Even in the pitch black, Maeve could hear the wet, ragged sound of his breathing. The king's strength, previously so overwhelming, suddenly felt dangerously brittle. We cannot stay here, Alistair rasped, his voice strained. The upper shafts will collapse entirely. Keep a firm grip on my belt. Step exactly where I step. They began a grueling, blind descent. The King's Passage was a steep, spiraling staircase carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. With every step, the air grew colder and damper, carrying the faint, metallic tang of underground springs. Maeve clung to the heavy leather of his belt as if it were her only tether to reality, her soft leather shoes slipping on the treacherous, uneven stairs. After what felt like hours of agonizingly slow progress, the narrow tunnel abruptly opened into a sprawling subterranean cavern. A faint, ghostly blue light illuminated the damp walls, patches of bioluminescent moss clinging to the cavern roof. A subterranean river rushed through the center of the grotto, its black waters churning wildly. It was in this pale, eerie light that Maeve finally saw the true extent of Alistair's condition. The Alpha King collapsed heavily against a stalagmite, his breathing reduced to a harsh, rattling wheeze. The left side of his doublet was completely saturated, the dark blood dripping steadily onto the cavern floor. But it wasn't the volume of blood that terrified Maeve. It was the color of the veins snaking up his neck. They were bulging and entirely black. "My king!" Maeve cried out, rushing to his side. She dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, her hands hovering over his ruined shoulder, unsure of how to help. "You said the sniper's bullet was lead. You said you would heal." Alistair's head lolled back against the stone, his skin deathly pale and slick with a feverish sweat. His golden eyes were dimming, fighting a losing battle against unconsciousness. "I miscalculated," he gritted out, his jaw clenched in agony. "Vanderbilt's men are thorough. The jacket was lead to pierce the armor, but the core, I can feel it burning. The core is pure, unalloyed silver." Maeve's blood ran cold. A silver bullet lodged near the heart of a werewolf, even in Alpha, was a death sentence if not immediately removed. The venomous metal was actively neutralizing his accelerated healing, poisoning his bloodstream with every beat of his heart. "We need a healer," Maeve panicked, looking around the desolate, empty cavern as if one might magically appear from the shadows. "We have to get you out of here." "There is no time," Alistair growled, his hand suddenly shooting out to grip her wrist with surprising, desperate strength. His gaze locked onto hers, intense and terrifyingly clear, despite the fever. "If that silver reaches my heart, the pack dies with me. Rowan wins. You have to cut it out, Maeve." "Me?" she gasped, recoiling violently. "I'm a chambermaid. I fold linens. I don't know how to perform surgery in the dark." With his trembling right hand, Alistair unbuckled a small, wickedly sharp hunting knife from his hip and forced the hilt into her palms. "You knew how to spot an assassination plot. You knew the scent of black powder. You are stronger than you pretend to be, little bird. Do it, now." Maeve stared at the gleaming steel in her hands, her whole body shaking. The King of the North was dying at her feet, and the survival of the entire realm was resting on her untrained, trembling fingers. She took a ragged, sobbing breath, nodded once, and moved closer. She ripped the ruined, blood-soaked velvet and linen away from his shoulder, exposing the ragged entry wound. The flesh around it was blackened and necrotizing, rejecting the silver. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I trust you," he murmured, his eyes sliding shut as he braced himself against the stone. Maeve plunged the tip of the hunting knife into the wound. Alistair let out a guttural, terrifying roar of pure agony, his claws extending and gouging deep trenches into the solid rock floor. Maeve squeezed her eyes against her own tears, digging through the burning, ruined muscle. Her fingers slipped on the slick blood, but she forced herself to keep going, probing the depths of the wound until the steel blade scraped against something agonizingly hard. "Got it," she sobbed. With a brutal twist of the blade, she pried the deformed, blood-slicked silver slug out of his flesh. It clattered against the stone floor, sizzling faintly. The change in Alistair was instantaneous. The moment the silver left his body, the black veins on his neck immediately began to recede. A violent, shuddering breath tore through his lungs as his alpha physiology rebooted. The torn edges of the muscle in his shoulder began to knit together before Maeve's very eyes, the terrible wound closing at a supernatural pace. Exhausted, Maeve dropped the knife and slumped back into the mud, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. She was breathing as hard as he was. Alistair slowly opened his eyes. The dimming light was gone, replaced by a radiant, burning amber that cut through the gloom of the cavern. He pushed himself off the rock, moving with a fluid, lethal grace that showed absolutely no trace of his previous near-death state. He stepped toward her, dropping to one knee in the mud so they were perfectly eye level. He reached out, taking her small, blood-stained hands in his massive ones. "Maeve," Alistair said, his voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through her chest. "You have saved my life twice, before the sun has even reached its zenith. You are no longer a servant of Ethelgard. You are under my absolute protection. No man, human or wolf, will ever raise a hand against you again." He leaned in, pressing his lips to the back of her trembling, bloodied knuckles in a gesture of profound, ancient fealty rarely given by a king to a human. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "We have a war to wage," the Alpha King whispered, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, vengeful promise as he looked toward the cavern's exit. "Let us go hunt a beta." Did the explosive tension between the ruthless Alpha King and his fiercely observant chambermaid leave you absolutely breathless? The betrayal runs deep, and the vengeance Alistair Sterling is about to unleash on the Vanderbilt Syndicate and his treacherous brother Rowan will be a bloodbath for the ages. But what does this profound new bond mean for Maeve? Will she rise from a lowly human servant to the Queen of the Northern Reaches, or will the looming shadow war consume them both? If you loved this thrilling medieval werewolf romance and want to see Alistair and Maeve hunt down the traitors, smash that like button and hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below telling us what you think Rowan's punishment should be when the king finally catches him. Share this video with your fellow fantasy romance lovers and join our pack for the next epic chapter.
Hi, my name is Mountain Confessions, the owner and manager of Mountain Confessions. After watching the video, Maid adjusts the Alpha King's collar. Your beta is armed. Don't enter the carriage. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What pulled me into this story was the tension between loyalty and betrayal. Sometimes the quietest people notice the danger everyone else overlooks, and one small warning can change everything. I also liked how the story showed that trust isn't always about power or titles. Often, it's built through small moments where someone chooses to protect another person without expecting anything back. Do you think the Alpha King would have listened if the warning came from someone else? And how important do you think instinct is when deciding who to trust? Stories like this make me think about how easy it is to ignore people we underestimate, even when they may see the truth more clearly than anyone else. If this story kept you thinking after the ending, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional Alpha King stories filled with tension and loyalty, feel free to like and subscribe for more whenever you'd like.